In this section, I'm going to discuss the Paris Peace Treaty of 1919 and some of the subsequent events that happened in the early 1920s. I'm going to save the rise of fascism and the rise of totalitarianism in Russia for Unit 3, although some of these events predate the Paris Peace Treaty. The Paris Peace Treaty of 1919 that followed World War I is sometimes known as, at least in American textbooks, as the Treaty of Versailles. But that's a bit limited, actually, into the sum total of the treaty. There were various treaties at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and the Treaty of Versailles is the one piece of that puzzle that is limited to just Germany and the conditions that were established against Germany following the war. There are other treaties as well. The Treaty of Trianon, for example, of 1920, was the treaty, part of the treaty assigned to the new nation of Hungary. The Treaty of Saint-Germain is the treaty that dealt with Austria. The Treaty of Sèvres dealt with the former Ottoman Empire, and that's going to be replaced in 1923 by the Treaty of Lausanne. And there's also the Treaty of Neuilly, which is the treaty that was established against Bulgaria. Each of these treaties had various conditions and are part of the sum total of the Paris Peace Treaty. There's also smaller pieces of this puzzle as well that weren't given separate names and weren't signed, but concern various territories around the world. For example, a part of the Chinese territory was given to Japan during this Paris Peace Conference, much to the chagrin of the Chinese. So there's other sections that are also part of this larger piece. So the Treaty of Versailles, we sometimes use as this broad term for the entire settlement, but that was only the German part of it. So to be more informed, you need to know that there's more treaties than just the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason for these different names dealt with where the signatories actually signed what room. So they're in the Palace of Versailles, and there's various rooms. And for example, the Trianon room was where the Hungarians were forced to sign in that palace. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is much maligned. It is used in a way by conventional historians and Orthodox historians to make a sweeping assessment of the interwar years, the years between World War I and World War II, and often in this conventional description, it is put forth that the Treaty of Versailles, the German part, was this crushing treaty that, from the ashes of this crushed nation, is what caused the rise of fascism in Germany and led to World War II. And that's kind of the quick history of the first half of the 20th century. Treaty of Versailles, Germany's severely punished, and then Germany rises under Hitler, and World War II begins. That's not how it happened, okay? And the treaty can be blamed for many, many different results, but we're going to try to look at it in a more sophisticated light, in the way that most historians would approach it today. So what are the settlements, and what is this level of harshness they're discussing? Well, part of the settlement is, in many ways, a determination of new boundaries in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is going to be the most contentious part of the settlement, where these lines are drawn and who drew them and how they are determined. When the peacemakers go to Paris, it is under the assumption this treaty is going to be different than past treaties. And they often compare to the Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars of 1815. And in the Congress of Vienna, the great powers come to an understanding of how the European continent should look in terms of empires and kingdoms, and how a conservative approach is going to be enforced under the leadership of Austrian Metternich. And so under the Congress of Vienna in 1815, it was basically said, the great power said, if a revolutionary force that had happened in France were to arise again in another part of Europe, it would be the great power's responsibility to internally crush that revolt. So it gave great powers permission to enter into other regions and crush revolts and such. And this happened, for example, in 1848. There were various revolutions throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and Russia came to the rescue of some of these great powers, of some of these empires, and helped crush these revolts or rebellions or revolutions, whatever the case may be. So, at the Paris Peace Treaty of 1919, they wanted to put that aside. They wanted to have open agreements and an open discussion and a rational approach to how this would all be settled. And geographers, for example, were brought in to help determine boundaries, and they were going to listen to various ethnic groups and try to assign various groups the proper territory based on their needs. But this was a very naive view of the region that they're going to place these new boundaries upon. So as we discussed, these were former empires. So we had the German Empire in the northern region, from what we think of modern Germany today, and Poland, and parts of the Baltics, under what used to be called Prussia and East Prussia. South of them was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a large chunk of land with many different nationalities. And then we had the former Ottoman Empire. So we take away this external structure of these empires and the rule of empires and the style in which these different nationalities were ruled. And suddenly there's a new idea in play. And the coined phrase comes from President Wilson. He had discussed in his 14 points that there would be a right of nations to self-determination. And self-determination said is that, nationalities have the right to rule themselves. So Poles could rule Poland, and Ukrainians would rule Ukraine, etc. And this kind of conception. And that sounds so promising, and that sounds so neat and tidy. But the reality on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe was that there was no place where Poles were at in some kind of congealed format where there'd be no other ethnic group. And in Austro-Hungary, in the Hungarian lands, for example, in Hungary there were Magyars, which are Hungarians, and there were Slovaks, and there were Serbs, and there were Romanians, and there were Jews, and there were Roma, which are Gypsies. There were Carpathian Rus, there were Lemkos, there were Wends, there were Slovenians, there were Austrian Germans, there were Saxon Germans from the 13th century. There's this whole multitude of peoples, and trying to determine where borders would be, new borders that would encapsulate these people, that would encircle these people, would be to deny the right of everyone else in your neighborhood, basically. It's choosing one over, the 15 others in your region. I'm going to stop here, and I'll discuss this a little bit more in the next section.